Watch Listen is a mostly game development and games industry podcast brought to you by Austin Wintory, who is a video game composer, Mike Bithell, who is a video game director, and Alana Pierce, who is a video game writer. The reason we have been able to make this show for 5 years now is thanks to our supporters on Patreon. So if you enjoy the show, we would love to have your support. Patrons also get totally ad-free episodes and extended cuts. I'm not exaggerating when I say they got a version of the start of this episode where Mike and Austin spoke about the weather for a while. And while we do love and appreciate all of our Patreon supporters, whether you are a supporter or not, we hope you enjoy the episode.
How did the rest of the chat go with Pierre? I've now played half of Dispatch. I wish I had made the time to play before that call, because I have all these questions now from having played half of it. And I haven't gone back and listened. Of course, I don't watch this show.
Who would? I would disrespect anyone who does.
I subscribe to I think it was Groucho Marx who said I would never join a club that would have me as a member.
Yeah.
But how was the rest? Were there any grand revelations? I'm particularly interested in their kind of design methodology about where narrative meets player agency, because it definitely presents hypothetically more agency than the typical Telltale game on which it is built. Like, it's more gamey feeling, obviously, with the whole Dispatch kind of thing itself is very obviously more gamey than the typical Telltale. But I was curious, I wonder how branching it actually gets. How much content is there?
Yeah, we didn't dig deep into it. There was some conversation around kind of, obviously there's a lot of, and this is what games are really good at, like the smoke and mirrors, right? A lot of stuff that makes you feel like you got way more.
Yeah, of course. Well, and Telltale was always notorious, sort of polarizing for that.
I imagine, like, I'm not gonna put words in his mouth. People should go back and watch it, but like, it is that kind of the amount of money they're presumably spending on those animations, like. You can't make, not everyone's got, the research. Like, I think what's interesting about what you did with the musical project was you could write a lot of music. You had the capacity and scope to do that, right? Whereas if you're doing like these kind of fully animated, like TV quality animation, kind of frankly better than a lot of stuff I've seen on TV recently.
Yeah,
like,
no kidding.
I can't imagine what the cost of like, it would be cool if this dialogue tree led us in this direction. Well, it would be cool, but it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to create the content. So,
I actually remember having this call or the conversation with Liam Essler, with the studio director, manager, and co-founder of Summerfall on Stray Gods. I remember him. They did a trailer, kind of like how Supergiant has done and others, where they made a very kind of high fidelity animation, just a little taste, to kind of spruce up the trailer. And I remember looking at that and going, what I would give if the whole game could look like this. And I asked him, what would be, surely, knowing Liam, I remember saying, surely you ran the numbers based on how much content we have, the sheer amount of animation that would be required at this level. And he was like, oh, it's like 20 million more to the budget or something. I'm probably quoting the number wrong, but it was like a tripling of the game's budget or something like that. I mean, for the sake of that, because our voice cast costs were outrageous.
Sparkling voice cast was.
Well, it was just because that also, the sheer amount of content just from that was already bananas.
That's true. Yeah, I wasn't factoring that in. Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's an enormous amount of content you're recording that most players obviously won't hear, and that's the point, right?
Yeah. No, I did the math once, or at least I approximated the math as best I could based on the songs, because there's also the dialogue to contend with. But I remember saying that an average playthrough would show you at most about 18% of the content. And the thing is, if you then did 2 playthroughs, that wouldn't double to 36%. It would go up by like 4%, maybe.
Because that trunk is remaining consistent, and it's just. Yeah. I think that's such a big part of like the indie the indie scale kind of production and the kind of the budgeting you do when you're putting a project like that together, it's so much tied to like what can we make for free, what can we make very cheaply, and what costs a lot. I do look at a game like Dispatch, and it's done very well, and it's an amazing team. Like I can't imagine what the budget of that game is, and I don't want to. Like, it scares me. I think they were in development for like 7 years. It's like, it's got an hour of like animated content. Like, it's amazingly impressive, but it's definitely outside of what I can get, made. So I'm definitely like, I'm specifically interested in where the exploits are in terms of like what can I make for free or very cheaply, and that's the stuff that
Right.
I think that's where I'm very good at getting production value into projects, is just kind of finding
It does.
those niches.
It strikes me. If this came up in the call, I'd be curious to hear what you learned. But it does strike me that they do a good job. There's a little bit of a hat trick going on in a very tasteful way. Not, I don't say this deprecatingly, because I'm honestly, I'm really loving the game. Um, the it's sort of two games running parallel to each other that really only barely touch each other.
They kiss like
Um,
softly and then move
yeah,
on. Yeah.
because as far as I can tell, I have yet to see any actual consequences of things I do while in dispatch mode in the narrative bits
Mm.
that flank that, So but it convinces you that they're related, because you start, like, I just finished the fourth episode, and it starts off with all this dialogue, and then you go into your morning shift, and you kind of imbue it psychologically with all this baggage you associate with the characters based on the scenes that you've just seen and done some basic dialogue tree stuff with. But I realized you could siphon this off. It kind of like how Inscription can just be modded as just the standalone card game, that's sort of not tied to the rest. You could make a dispatch mode that is 100% freestanding, and I don't think it would it would be missing the kind of psychological subtext. But as far as I can tell, there's no gameplay impacts, with some basic exceptions. The obvious ones, like you have a choice of which character to slot into your team after choosing someone to cut, things like that. So that's the them kissing, I guess. But it's one of those where I go, it's pretty tasteful smoke and mirrors, because I
That's
suspect you
smart
don't.
as well. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's smart.
you end up with fairly constrained production needs on your animated filmmaking,
Mhm.
basically. And then the player is just kind of adding in all these assumptions about the rest themselves.
Well, it lets you manage your constraints, right? So, like, yes, on the animation side, you have literally like X number of minutes that you have the budget to make, so you have to make sure that you're spending that well. But on the game side, on the part that the player is actually kind of making like game choices in and kind of moment to moment gameplay, right? There, you actually want as few constraints as possible. Like both sides of that equation would be fucked up by having the constraints of the other half kind of applied to them. So it makes sense to kind of modularize, kind of silo those two things off separately.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a tricky balance, because you can also end up with something where where the story aspect feels completely tacked on. Like, we've definitely, I
Mm-hmm.
think back to some of our previous games, and we've definitely made games where the story's happening over here and the game's happening over here, and those two things kind of, it feels more like you're maybe playing a game while listening to a podcast, which is not not the cohesive narrative design I would always aim for, right? So I think you can go too far with that, but yeah, these guys are masters of the craft. They're doing it in a very smart way. So I respect it.
It's interesting how that what you just said, I think, is the hallmark of the games we grew up playing. Like, most games always, in hindsight, seem like they were made where they make a game, and then now that they've got the mechanics stood up, they go, by the way, we should put like a name to this character, and we should think of a reason why
Why
they're
is this guy
running and
punching this
jumping.
other guy? Yeah,
Yeah.
100%.
And
Yeah.
I feel like so many games, they either didn't even try to have a story, if depending on the how far back you go. Like, you think of
Mhm.
classic arcade games and stuff where that was not even really a factor. No, like, no one asked what star system the Space Invaders came from. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I feel like once we migrated into those early, Commodore 64 and NES and whatnot, most of that assumption seemed to just carry straight, and then gradually the sophistication grew. But even then, I remember it was so revelatory feeling in the '90s playing games like Warcraft 2, where narrative events would happen in mid-mission that would tie directly to the cutscenes, and it really felt like, holy crap, this is a unified experience in a way that was super not the norm
No, I
before
mean, I,
that.
I always go back to like the original Metal Gear Solid. I think if you weren't around for Metal Gear Solid when it came out, you cannot comprehend how big of a deal that game felt like. You know, there's kind of the cinematic video game kind of thing. Like it was back then. That was just yes. I remember just being my mind being blown that story would matter in a game where you're sneaking around.
Right.
Like it was just such a insane thing. But I think there's also like I think there's also value though in the kind of the toyetic thing. That's a word I use too much now, but like the kind of the thing of making games and by bashing toys together and then working out some story justification. A good example of that's like I just saw a couple of nights ago. I saw the new Predator movie, right?
Badlands.
Which is have you seen it?
Not yet, no.
Really, it's a very fun movie that pretends to be dumber than it is for the first hour to kind of lull you in, and then it's very, very cool. But one of the gimmicks of that film, and I'm probably edging towards spoilers, so I'll stop, but like that film doesn't exist if a comic book series 20 years ago based on Predator hadn't done something that they just thought would be cool. And it's like kind of so you can get that kind of playful writing, like writing that works the way that like kids make up stories on the playground. I think there's value to that as well, and I think that's something that I feel like the '90s games scene occasionally did really interesting stuff with, and I'd like to play with and go back to a little bit. But yeah, I'm talking nonsense.
No, no, not at all. It's funny because it's a topic I think about a lot that I always mean to bring up here, and then we get distracted by whatever's the kind of current flavor that we're wrestling with. But I've always wanted to kind of, particularly from your point of view as thinking design wise and game direction wise and whatnot. Um, it seems like um, because games were always so mechanics driven, and it was this revelation 20 and to 30 years ago that the story would start to actually really matter. We saw this inevitable trajectory where games kept going, how far can we go down that where story only matters? And the natural consequence was, that little window, 2012 plus or minus, Journey being one of the big beneficiaries of this wave of popularity, where you have a bunch of games that sideline mechanics to the extreme. The idea being that mechanics are minimal and solely in service. And I to me the apex predator of that genre was Chinese Room with like Dear Esther and Everybody's Gone to the Rapture. Games that it's just what's the absolute least you can do at least you can ask the player to have to do. And so obviously we had this window where games were the least amount gamey possible. And what's interesting is I feel like that it seems to me, just kind of looking at the trends, that really thoroughly has played itself out, and that players they were fascinated with the novelty of it, but that at its heart, systems seem to really be the defining characteristic of what gamers broadly, to the extent that one can generalize, which we know we can't, but it seems like that's just so important, that a thing that you can actually really kind of dance with. It doesn't necessarily have to be about skill, but I do feel like that really is proving enduringly a thing that people come back to, that's sort of, it's a defining characteristic of games. And if you have a great story to tell, great. But, I just find myself going, I wonder, because at the time it felt like games like Journey and Dear Esther and whatnot were revealing that, maybe there's just going to be all these different kind of sectors. And then I was like, well, actually, maybe that one's real fringe, as it turns out. Very like Citizen Sleeper being a recent, now there's a sequel out, a sort of recent IP that seems to be of that ilk, but especially being super text, solely text based, it doubles down on the idea that we know we're fringy, Whereas then I look at a game like Expedition 33, which is extremely narrative, but holy crap, it's so gamey as well. I mean, it's one of those, like I've been evangelizing to Angela about that game, and I finally was like, just I'm just gonna play again. I want to play it a second time anyway. So I started playing it at home, and she kind of hangs out while I play it, so she can kind of look over my shoulder, and she's like, okay, show me what has everybody all worked up. And then it's like I'm in an hour assigning my pictos and doing my build, and she's like, holy shit, like she's a big Elden Ring player, and she goes, I didn't realize this was that kind of game. And I said, that's what's so remarkable, is it's shockingly gamey. I thought it was going to be way less gamey when I first heard about it earlier this year. And so, but it seems to confirm this idea that that's really important as a baseline assumption about, just if you were to just pick a gamer at random, that it doesn't have to be that kind of game, but just the idea that there's something to sink your teeth into. And this is circling back, and then I'll shut up, to Dispatch. Is like, again, I think that's part of what makes Dispatch better than the average Telltale game. And I loved, Wolf Among Us, Walking Dead, the Tales from the Borderlands. Like I consider myself a fan of the Telltale games, but I feel like they've kind of one up the formula very positively, because there's a gaminess now in there that actually renders it more palatably a game, if that makes sense. Does any of what I'm saying make sense?
No, it does. I think there's a few things interrupting each other. I think two things. I guess there's two angles of attack I'd take to what you're saying. One is, attack implies, I actually agree with what you're saying, to be clear, but just in terms of thinking about it,
wrestle with.
There you go. Wrestle with the concepts. I think I remember reading a thing I think it was when I was a student. So like it would have been like 15 years ago at this point, 20 years ago if I'm being honest. I remember reading a thing which basically posited the opinion that games, the concept of play in games and in general, have existed entirely around rule sets and multiplayer for the entirety of human history. And then you have this window where computers get good enough to simulate other participants in a game, and we have single player. So like the idea of like all of human history, play has been a communal activity based around rule sets and agreed upon logic. And then for about a 30-year window, we started playing games on our own. And this, I remember reading this 20 years ago and it's saying, this seems like it's probably a temporary situation. Like probably we will return to the mean. There's probably a very human need for games and play to be a collaborative exercise in kind of shared spaces. And I thought that was interesting. I think that's, I don't fully buy it, but I think it's an interesting kind of lens to think about, and you can contextualize a lot of this stuff of like, maybe we're a blip. Maybe the idea that you would kind of be alone playing a game is something, if you think about the pre-computer age, like Solitaire is the game you play on your own with cards, and it's called Solitaire. It's the single player mode of cards, right?
Yeah.
But we've invented all these other games with cards, and we've always played these. It's a unique outsider kind of experience.
And I always associate Solitaire as, that thing to pass the time when you have no other option. That was always how it was kind of presented, which would seemingly support the argument.
And there's an argument that we invented an opiate. We invented a new kind of very addictive, interesting interaction in kind of games you play alone. And that, people played them for a while. And on a business level, maybe social media is going to take that audience and be the new thing you do alone to pretend you're with people, and maybe there's an angle that's going to kind of shift away completely. I don't fully buy that, because the key thing, as I always kind of moan about to people, is like, nothing ever dies. People still listen to radio. Like, there will always be this kind of stuff, and I want to be making it for the rest of my life. But the argument that like it's going to stop being a mainstream focus, or it's going to be something that kind of, yeah, it's like it's like stamp collecting. It's a specific thing that specific aficionados do, but like the mainstream moves on. Maybe Call of Duty was the biggest single player game that will ever exist. Like maybe that was the peak of it, and now that's drifting off. I think that's an interesting conversation. The other thing though is, and I think is also a massive factor here, and I'm having this conversation in lots of different directions with lots of different people at the moment, is Fortnite and what Fortnite has done to games in general. People are, on the whole, and I think this is backed up, everything I'm saying I think is backed up by data here. People are buying fewer games. They are specifically using, they're making fewer cheap purchases, and they're buying largely bigger things. If you're playing Fortnite, you have that drip feed of content, your friends are on there. If you have 10 quid burning a hole in your pocket, you're going to spend it on V-Bucks, you're going to go and buy a cool skin for your character or what have you. You're not necessarily going to go and try that weird indie game because you're already in an ecosystem, you're already enjoying that game, and you're just going to keep investing back into that. And I do think that potentially gels with what you're saying of like, to pull someone, I would say it's less about people intrinsically don't want those kind of smaller experimental experiences. I think it's that we have to yell louder to get them to actually kind of come over and play our game. And one of the great ways to yell is innovation, value for money, big, interesting stuff. And systems might play into that. So something like Expedition 33 kind of breaks through because it has all of that massively engaging kind of gameplay and also has an aesthetic and also has a story and also, has the Jeff Keighley machine kind of rolling behind it and kind of building up the name of the developers. So I think there's layers that, but I think it might be less about like the intrinsic interest of the audience and more about what can actually break through the noise of the game they're playing, be that Fortnite, Helldivers, any of these lifestyle games that people
Minecraft, and I think
Yeah.
Minecraft and Fortnite are, and like GTA 5 are still basically 80% of gaming
Yeah.
cycles.
And it didn't used to be that way. You used to have the big AAA games, but they would kind of wane, and like, an indie game would come out. And if there wasn't a big AAA game around, people just to really hammer home the fact that I turned 40 last week, people used to get bored,
Belated
Austin.
happy birthday.
Thank you. People used to get bored, Austin. No one gets bored anymore. No one runs out of content in any of the things that they're engaging with. So they don't go, well, maybe I'll go and play that weird rectangle game that I saw on the store page a couple of weeks ago. Like that thought's not going to cross their mind. So we have to work harder as developers to kind of make stuff, I think, that's like engaging enough and interesting enough that we pull them over. We find them in a different opportunity. We find them a different opportunity to get to them or something like that. I think we're going to all have to innovate a lot to keep the lights on, basically.
Yeah, I mean, and that's sort of a tale as old as time.
Sure.
Like the quintessential film example would be Star Wars, where sci-fi was not a blockbuster genre at all. It was fringe, niche, heady. It was associated with Planet of the Apes and 2001
Yeah.
and the Andromeda Strain. It was not big spectacle, crazy summer family experience or anything like that. So, innovation opening up whole new windows is certainly nothing new. I think it's awesome. Nothing pleases me more. I think it's one of those classic
For an
things
audience, it's good for for the audience. Obviously, they're going to hopefully get really competitive shit, right? People are going to really
Well, and it also, I think it's good for developers, even though it's tough in the way that going to the gym is good for you and not necessarily fun for most people. Like I do think that the experience of going, the lesson of the success of a game like Dispatch, or the lesson of the success of a game like Hades a few years ago, which Hades 2 is riding the wave beautifully of, or Silksong even, but certainly Expedition 33, is they're all characterized by someone who kind of had the bravery to do a thing that was unique, and they also did that thing very well. They either kit bashed unexpected things together, or they just went somewhere sort of genuinely novel. And I think it's all, I mean, I know you can relate to this. The frustrating thing that you witness is everybody going, "Oh my God, Expedition 33 shows that, you know, big narrative Japanese flavored RPGs are the new hotness. Let's make a bunch of those." And you're like, that's so not the lesson. The lesson is the individuality.
conversation. Yeah, I mean that was the conversation when Dispatch kind of when those numbers first started going in a very good direction. I think I said this even on the show was, I've seen it be a discourse since, is you could not walk into a publisher and pitch them a visual novel, you know, a few years ago. Now you can go in and go, they can sell, you just have to support them. I think another great thing with Dispatch, putting to one side the fact that it's an excellent game and it is obviously an excellent project, I think one of the other really interesting
In fairness,
trends,
also they just just to insert. In fairness, they also did, the pedigree of their cast became its own thing.
well,
That
that was
made
kind
people
of
go,
that's where I was going. That's where I was going. Is I think what's really interesting to me with Dispatch is how utterly uninterested Dispatch was with a lot of the old ways of promoting your game or kind of selling your game. It's I think it did premiere. I think I was in the audience actually. I think it premiered at Gamescom at Keighley's thing. I think, but I might be wrong about that.
Sounds right. Yeah, it was. It
But,
was
but
not.
it wasn't. But it's not. It's not played the game. It's not done the big splashy press, games industry press, and kind of the specialist kind of old school outlets. It's largely kind of promoted via, you know, streamers. Obviously, bringing in a lot of streamers to be voices on the game is a smart play, and kind of it's being promoted in a way that feels quite novel and interesting. And kind of is, like you say, playing off of the pedigree of those actors and that cast. It's a good cast. It's also a cast with I haven't sat down and done it, but I think it's a cast with literally hundreds of millions of subscribers on YouTube and Twitch and all of these channels as well. Like, and that matters. That means something. You can really build up. I mean, Moist Critical alone is probably like an enormous portion of that, but like, you know, Mercer, like it's an insane cast from like that promo point of view as well.
Oh, yeah,
I think that's interesting. It used to be kind of, I remember I've done some stuff with kind of famous actors before, and I remember being surprised at how little it moved the needle. And I think we're in an era where that does help. Again, on top of making a good fucking thing, obviously. But I think
There's also a big difference between. I also wonder if the analytics on that, like, did Jacksepticeye move more copies of Dispatch than Aaron Paul? From a, I would think so. I would
probably, right, from a metrics point of view. But then Aaron Paul brings that kind of credibility and the kind of the you know, the respect that he's accrued as an actor. You know, so it's.
That's what's so funny, you know, is like Jeffrey Wright probably sold no copies until
but when
himself.
I saw he was in it, I was like, this is.
But there's a certain sense of like, oh, okay, so they have you know, people who are like, because I think it would be also one of those. I had never heard Jacksepticeye act in any earnest sense before playing the game, and going, if he was awful, it sort of would be, it would kind of be like funny. It was kind of like when Rahul played the Minotaur in Stray Gods. We didn't want someone who felt like this world-class singer for that role. Rahul's obviously a great actor, but I mean, for his singing bits, it was one of those where I was like, the more sort of trembly and shaky that you are, the better this is going to play. He actually kind of ended up doubling down on that and trying to make himself, in a sense, even worse. Like, he went from a middle of the road karaoke performance to a kind of breaking apart kind of performance, which is actually ironically a testament to his acting. But the idea that, like, his badness, quote unquote, made it charming. If Jacksepticeye is bad, I think it somehow oddly is charming. So
Yeah.
you get the best of everything in a situation like that. I don't think he is bad, but if he were to have been, it would be funny to be like, yeah, but come on,
But
he's not an actor, you know?
that's where I look to the quality of the team. Is I don't think that team would have put like someone in that sucked. Like I think if they'd gotten a bad performance, they would have walked away from that performance. I think
Probably, yeah,
that's the
probably.
testament of the quality. But yeah, I think this. I think it's interesting. It's weird. Hollywood's known this for like 50 years, but now what's interesting is you see Hollywood people starting to pull away from their engagement with streaming platforms and YouTubers and that kind of them starting to go, well. I was listening to a thing earlier where they were talking about a lot of movies have opened this in the last few months from household name. Everyone's talking about them, famous actors and actresses, but the movies themselves are not doing well. What's doing well is the Hot Ones video, the formats, the online formats are where the engagement's happening, and the film studios are going, well, what are we doing then? You know, because obviously the film is their revenue stream. So if it's an interesting kind of curve they're on. Maybe they're a bit further down there. I don't know. I think
I
right
have no
now
idea. I think
it's going to be. There's going to be the next couple of years going to be interesting because everyone's struggling, which means everyone's going to throw a million ideas at the wall and try things. And some of those things will work and be exciting and cool, and many of them will not work. Obviously,
I hope what you just said is true. I fear it's actually, the ones that do well will be the ones that do what you did. You just said. I think the ones who go, okay, you know, the A24, if we have $100 million to spend, let's spend it on you know, $10 million movies,
yeah.
and not take $100 million bet on a thing that who God only knows, and the hope that we get the next Jordan Peele or Weapons or, you know, Everything Everywhere All at Once, that kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing, which to me is exciting. Like my fantasy world would be that we're entering into another period like the 70s, where when the 50s and 60s saw Hollywood's existing model completely fracture apart, and all those big classic epics of, you know, the Ten Commandments and Ben-Hur and all,
Yeah.
suddenly we were going, well, we can't do that anymore. And suddenly you had the rise of the Scorseses and you know, the Spielberg and everybody who was trying very different things,
Yeah.
especially the kind of Scorsese, when you think about that, or like Kubrick, where there were filmmakers that compared to like a 1950s Hollywood film, they were basically avant-garde.
Well, they were being
And
freed up as well. Like Kubrick had done Spartacus, right? He'd been doing the big cinema pictures, and he took advantage of that opportunity to kind of go and do more interesting work. So yeah,
yeah,
I think there's that side of it. I do think game publishing is truly screwed, and I'm intrigued to see how that recovers or changes and shifts because you know their business model does fundamentally just doesn't work anymore. The
what do you
things that were
think finances game? Would it just be funds basically? Would there be like, you know, it's not so much like you would essentially be responsible for self-publishing, but there's, you know, like a game hedge fund or something, like a VC kind of a thing? Or
there's VCs in the space. There's people doing stuff. I think on many levels, like people have said games are going to turn into films for like 30 years, but I think genuinely we might be about to, but not necessarily in like the positive razzmatazz way people mean. And what I mean by that is that if you look at film, it's the funding networks. I mean, you know this better than I do. The funding networks are complex and multifaceted. Films are not film. A film very rarely does a film have like a guy shows up, gives them the money, and they make the film. Usually, it's 20 different revenue streams, half of which weren't there when they made the film, and they had to go and sell the film at a festival and get that. Blah 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 blah. I think that kind of idea of like independent funding of games, so there will be like if I want to make a mid-sized game, I have to basically go and like get 10 different people to buy into what I'm doing, and that person's only going to invest if this other person invests, and this person's only going to invest if I can confirm that that voice actor is going to be attached, and blah 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 blah. I think all of that's coming. I think
which is
that's gonna,
very much how film operates these days.
and
For
it's
sure.
messy, but I think that is more, that would weather this storm more. And we're also seeing the generation of people who grew up loving video games are aging into rich old people now. So there are people who you could theoretically go to in the same way as people want to fund movies because they're excited by movies. The game buying, the person who's been playing games since they were a kid, many of those are now like, independently wealthy, or, they're the kinds of people who are funding independent film. So there's that stuff. I think then, though, as well, the scary aspect of that and where it kind of spirals is what I just described does not support a studio. It does not support a kind of we have 200 people on staff who are making games. Everyone goes to contractors, which means that in order to protect themselves, they unionize, which means that you have that kind of relationship that exists in the film industry between the unions and the film studios. All of that stuff is going to come into games and is, I think, accelerating. Like that's the shift that's going to happen.
That actually doesn't strike me as a bad thing. I'm obviously heavily biased by having only ever worked as a contractor. It's the only thing I know. So of course I don't want to pretend to have data from every angle of this,
Sure.
but every film, like when you're like, let's say I want to do a movie called The Microphone. And the contract will be signed with an entity that is The Microphone Movie LLC.
Yeah.
And because, in case people aren't aware, every production, they form a corporation in which to put the money however they raised it, and then that company basically gets a bunch of independent contractors, everyone from the actors to the director to everyone. It's owned by whoever basically owns the rights to the film. Which might be just one entity or shared or whatever. It has all of its royalty and and then basically once the movie is made, that company essentially becomes a paperwork and a bank account forevermore, or a thing that gets sold off into a larger package at some point down the road. And so you rarely ever do a deal with Disney or Fox or whatever directly. Those are so few. There are so few projects that are made that way. The vast majority, even big movies, are some one-off entity that's made. And I look at that and I go, that it's more volatile. It means that it's a gig economy, which is, again, I look at it and I go, well, I have only limited sympathy as someone whose whole career has had to be built that way, but I recognize that it's probably terrifying for people that the idea of a roving programmer or a roving artist.
It's the transition. It's the transition. Like
which I get, that would be terrifying for sure.
And what you're describing is also, you're right, obviously, and I get where you're coming from with film. You are talking, though, from a position of an industry that has had this paradigm for 60, 70 years at this point. Like the idea of a unionized workforce, contract gigs, project to project kind of as a structure. A lot of the things that make that survivable happened over those 50 years. So things like health insurance, right? Like the idea that actors can get health insurance through their union, that kind of thing. That's not something that happens immediately. Those kind of things take a while to happen. And I imagine, do I think that in 50 years' time, the games industry will have settled into this and will be a relatively decent place to work because of that? Yeah, of course I do. But with film, you're looking at 50, 70 years. With music, you're looking at obviously a much longer time period, which we've bored the audience chatting about that before. But there's definitely will be growing pains to it. There would be a process, and I think that process would be very tough. And people are used to a certain way of working and a certain structure to their lives. And I think if that's about to be upended, that's going to cause a lot of suffering and stress and all these things and real material impact. So I don't know. I hope I'm wrong, to be honest.
It's one of those where I could see it. I could see it flourishing both ways, but I also it does seem that the army of contractors is the inevitable destination, just from the standpoint that it's so much less risky because you are not having to hire people as employees
for the companies. Sure. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, well, therefore, for the companies, therefore the financing. If I go, I uh, want to give you $1 million to make your game, and the two models are, well, we have this flexible way where there's no actual real employees, but we can scale up and down our contractors, and we can kind of modify the ship as we go and realize, okay, our burn rate is coming in lower than we expected. We can afford to bring on one more person, whatever.
Mm.
You're a lot more liquid. Obviously, there's trade-offs because you might, especially right now at this current moment where the transition hasn't even really theoretically begun in any grand scale, your access to the top talent will for sure, like if I want the world's greatest graphics programmer, I doubt I could hire them as a 3-month contract with maybe an extension. I mean, maybe now with all the insanity with layoffs, but as a
Mm.
setting that aside as a current outlook, but just generally speaking,
Sure.
the top people in the world are going to be employed already at not Naughty Dog or Insomniac or
Mm.
an Xbox to Bethesda, Machine Games, or those kinds of
Yeah.
places are going to have their pick of the really senior experience. It's going to be hard to cobble together a true, like, unless you're a studio that is building it based on existing relationships, obviously. But that's where I
But it's
go,
still
that
it's still a lot. And the flip side of what you're saying as well is you're right. A system like that massively incentivizes big players to pay very very good money for the best people. That's brilliant. The challenges that creep in, and I know lots of people who are very very far below the line in the film industry, and if you're not like hitting a level, or if you're at the start of your career, if you've had to take some time off for health issues, or you had a kid, whatever, like these kind of things, it can be very hard to get back on that ladder, or even on that ladder in the first place. Because if you're hiring for a film and you've got two candidates, and one is 25% more but they've got this experience, versus someone who's junior and doesn't know what they're doing yet, in the employee model, the junior is an amazing opportunity to train someone up, build them up to be the kind of person you need them to be, get them cheap for a couple of years while you're doing that, build with them and kind of create that person. Whereas, obviously on the contractor level, it's what do I need right now? And I'm not building a company over time, so it does have those knock-ons, but it has worked for film. So I think in the fullness of time, with proper unionization supporting the employees in that scenario, or the contractors in that scenario, I think this can work. But it's going to be, if it does happen, it's going to be a big transition and messy.
Yeah, and obviously, I don't ever mean to kind of glide by the fact that it's
Oh
a
no.
it's a very painful transition for people that have been working a certain way. I have
For
a lot
sure.
of sympathy. If you're somebody who's built yourself up over 20 years at like Blizzard or somewhere where you could have a real long
Mm.
span, and you're pulling in like 300,000-400,000, you senior level fill in the blank department, and then suddenly find yourself out on the market and going, the only work that's available is like $90,000 job, um, or maybe less. And from your standpoint, you're going, I'm looking at what, a 70+% pay reduction. Um, I look at that and I go, that's just one of those brutal moments that I don't know. I don't know. There's no magic bullet to that. I think that it's this is where I was just saying this to someone the other day, where I've I've always maintained a very mixed diet of types of projects. Partially, it's just the luck of the random things that
Mm.
come your way, and you can't really choreograph your life in this way. But part of it is I do try. I've always liked that I try to have, there's projects that are, they have quite a bit of resources for us to work with. And it's not a lot, it's not the scrappiest thing, but I
Mm.
always want to make sure that if I'm working on one of those, I'm also working on something that's just like, let's make a game, whatever we got to do. Like when my collaborations with Andy Schatz, for example, have been those where we've never had like deep pockets on those projects. Or my favorite was 10 years ago working simultaneously with Tale of Tales, Michael and Urea, and Ubisoft on Assassin's Creed, where it was
Yeah.
like the single at that time, the single largest and the single smallest project I had ever worked on were running parallel to each other. And so I've been able to benefit from that, because what that means is that someone goes, "Hey, we want to hire you on the sequel to the game that you did, but we're having to do it at a fraction of the budget. Like, the only way we're even able to make this sequel is because we're coming in at a third the budget of the first one, but we still want to make it. So, are you able to?" And I'm like, I don't have a prescriptive norm. I go out of my way to not have that. Different projects require different situations. And if I just start putting in floors like that, I will find myself in exactly the situation you're describing, where it's suddenly I'm mostly just unemployable. And I'm like, that's the goal, is to work with creative teams. And the money is not the primary consideration. It's obviously important, but it's not my motivation. I'm very much all about who I want to work with, and I'm lucky that I'm able to make that my priority. Obviously, it's not lost on me. But yeah, I have a lot of sympathy for those that have no kind of they don't know how to be scrappy, basically, and so it's going to be a struggle. It's going to be a huge
hurdle. And I think there's going to be different shapes of it as well. I know, like, one of the things that I've thought about, especially with you and with composers, and it's true of sound designers, it's true of directors, arguably, like, the value you bring is you, and you come along and you do a very clear and specific job, and you do it well, and you collaborate with the team to kind of execute that as well as you can. What's interesting with a lot of other disciplines, and especially at the scale of like AAA, is you have so many people who are a team, right? The team is the thing that is delivering the asset, not an individual or an individual with subcontractors. But it's a very important
dynamic to not overlook in all this, for sure.
Well, I think what's interesting is seeing how people are starting already, because of course a lot of the bigger game studios are showing their employees that they are disposable, right? And they're acting in a way that kind of makes those employees start to think about this potential future and how they can navigate it. I've heard a story of I won't say any identifying details, but like an art team where the art director has their art team, and they now negotiate as a block. So if you want to hire this art director,
right,
these are his 20 guys. He's going to bring them with
him. It's like
him.
Hiring an animation studio to subcontract out your animation.
You're getting honestly, that crew. It's how a lot of things happen in film as well. Of like, a head of department will have like their go-to group they work with, and they will bring them from job to job. And that's seeing that start to happen in the games industry, because this art director, if you see that guy's name on a game, I can tell you 10 names that'll be underneath it, right? So he's kind of taken this team with him wherever he's gone. I think that sort of kind of organization will happen, and I would encourage people to start to think about that networking, not just thinking about who's going to hire you, but also thinking about like the sub team you could be, a group of people who could get hired for a project, because I think that's going to be much more common, as it already is in film. In film, there's definitely like departments will get hired, rather than individuals.
There's definitely already precedent for this in the audio. It's less common with music, because just the natural kind of personality stereotype of composers tends to be the lone wolf. But I have a friend named Oleksii Lauzachuk who just scored the new Outer Worlds sequel that just came out. And he runs a company called Interleave, which is like, essentially they can offer turnkey, I think they're full turnkey audio, but I think they specialize in music, where he is like, look, I will come on board as your kind of lead composer, but in the case of Outer Worlds, they needed all this radio music and stuff, and so he's subcontracting all that out. And I don't know the full ins and outs of how he did that particular game. I haven't had a chance to ask him yet, but I've just seen what he's been sharing online. And sound wise, there's also a handful of these outfits where, like a Shell in the Pit, who've done a million big indies, like Chia, worked with them on Monaco 2 earlier this year. There's Power Up Audio, Kevin Ragami, who did, like Tunic, where you hire them and you get, there's like, a core team of however many, 2, 3, 4, 5 people doing sound design and voice editing and blah, blah. And if they take on a project that requires they scale up, they'll go hire temporary contractors to scale up for that sake of that project. But otherwise, you're like you said, it's like a roving sound department that can take on a few jobs at a time. And there's definitely, obviously Hans Zimmer is the ultimate example.
I was going to say Hans Zimmer has created a network of branched off guys, right? Like
Well, I mean,
that's
there's sort of, I mean, what he's created is sort of a whole thing unto itself because it's an entity of like dozens, probably north of 100 employees of composers, assistants, music editors, engineers. It's a
but a
whole
number
big
of whom are
giant
now
operation.
like people in their own right who, household name composers in their own right who've kind of come out of that system, right? Or have
Oh, for
grown
sure.
through
He
that
kind
system,
of
yeah.
graduated. Most famous graduates of his program, for sure. The longest running would be Harry Gregson Williams,
Yeah.
who has done does all of most of Ridley Scott's movies these days, and he did all of Tony Scott's movies back in the day, and then of course John Powell, who's just done the new Wicked movie and all the How to Train Your Dragon movies. Well, they started as
Yeah.
Hans assistants in the late '90s that made their way into solo careers, and there's a
Mm.
bunch of those for sure. But he's kind of a unique model. It's sort of Hans is very much in the kind of empire building approach. But the idea that's I had never thought of the idea of a company like Interleave or Power Up Audio existing in other departments, but it makes sense that there would be like an art
Yeah.
department. Out of curiosity, would a
It's going
group
to be
like that,
interesting.
do you think that, like, because when I think of some of the great artists in games, Gen
Mm.
Z over at Supergiant, Matt Nava, of course, Giant Squid, I think of like these super talented visual artists. Part of what defines them is that they have a thing they do, a very specific, like
Mm.
many. So if you had an art department that was led by some person, would the idea be that you're hiring them for that look? Or is it that, no, we can handle whatever look what you want is a professional audio art team that knows the game pipeline and all
Yeah, I
that.
don't know. I don't know. Like, there's already like art outsourcing companies you can go to that have, done stuff. They generally provide kind of a generic service, so we can provide you whatever art you want. What do you want? We'll do your art for you. That's fine. But I could absolutely see it becoming more specific in the way you're describing. That it's like, no, I'm going to Hans Zimmer because I have a specific style I want, and even if I get one of his people to do the soundtrack, I know the realm we're in, right?
The
So
style,
I
yeah,
don't,
is given. Yeah, right.
so I don't know. I don't know. But
Yeah, it's
it's
very
it's
interesting.
weird because I think the fundamental challenges are going to come around the very collaborative nature of game development, especially in kind of your code, your art, your design, like where these teams need to be interleaved. They need to be completely working all the time together. Again, like it's the irony of like I read the oral history of the Marvel Cinematic Team that came out I think last year, and the big innovation of the Marvel movies was they made films like video games. They built a
Mm,
team. They had their concept art team. They had their
right.
pre-production teams. Directors came in and they got to work on the talky bits. But ultimately, that was a development cycle that was happening there with those movies, which is how they made 3 movies a year and made insane money for as long as they did. It's these ideas kind of bounce back and forth between the industries. I don't know if what I'm saying is even where it goes, but I do think the current situation feels like untenable and feels like both employees need better structure and better way of working and being able to know they're putting food on the table. But also the companies who would be hiring those people need to work out a new way of making stuff that has the flexibility you're talking about. So I don't know. I don't know where it shakes out. This is one model, but there's others. From my perspective, I'm going to be small for a while, I suspect. So I will not be participating in whatever innovations happen in the structural makeup of the games
Yeah, I
industry.
mean, well, that itself seems like that's almost certainly a a big wave as well. Is just like how small can you
Mm.
get? This is one of those where I think an unpleasant truth. I know it's a radioactive topic, but I think that the deployment of AI is essentially going to
Mm.
it's going to facilitate that whether we like it or not. It's
I
one of
mean,
those
rightly or
that
wrongly, people will start those. I'm interested to see.
it
I
will
have
it will
started to
allow
hear.
smaller teams to exist in
Yeah,
a way. I always come back to you going, my first job is now a checkbox in Unity or
yeah.
whatever. Like I just go, if every department can develop a version of that sort of thing where 3 people can make a game that used to take 30, on the one hand, the aesthetics, like pretty much everything I've ever seen or heard aesthetically associated with AI is kind of meh at best, if not just outright bizarre and horrible. Um, but if there's things that are tools that are force multipliers, that if we end up in a world where there's 50,000 5-person teams that are making games, if that's just the only sustainable model, I'd rather have that than the collapse and destruction of the industry.
Irony, yeah, no, I mean, to be clear, when I have an issue with AI stuff, it's very much the kind of the generative, we're going to make entire video games with a prompt and the threat, all of that stuff. Like, but games have always games teams have always been accelerating. Like, if you cannot possibly, as a game developer, I think it's an unwinnable argument to be like, there shouldn't be innovation. I don't like that particular approach and that kind of stuff, but like, you can't make Assassin's Creed without the kind of generative tools that the games industry has been using, procedural generation stuff for decades. Like, we are already using tools that accelerate. The game I can make right now on my own is more impressive than the game I can make on my own 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Like, there is that acceleration. That's just a reality of the industry going on. I think what's interesting, what I'm waiting to see, I'm not using any generative AI stuff in my stuff, but like, I am interested to see how others use it. I think the real telling things, I do know there are others who are using it for all areas of game development. I'm skeptical that they'll actually finish their games. I'm skeptical that you can get to. I think potentially it's a good way of kind of making some junk quickly. But given how complicated games are and how kind of tough bug fixing is, just with code written by people that you can go and tap on the shoulder and ask them what went wrong, I don't know if these games are going to come to the market. I think they're going to fizzle out. I might be wrong about that.
I really think you're. I think I have a very similar instinct. Because all the music generative tools that are out there don't let you do any of the stuff that are considered absolutely core. Like, for example, we're doing a game together and you go, hey, the piano is a little loud in that mix. Is there any way to just tame it just a little bit? I have a bunch of different ways between EQs and balance levels and all kinds of ways that I could address that note because I have access to all the guts. If you have a thing that's just being spun up out of effectively ones and zeros, the thing doesn't even really know what the constituent parts are. It doesn't, and they're getting more sophisticated, but still I look at it and I go, this doesn't let you actually do professional work. It's like a cool card trick kind of sorts, I guess, but it's not a professional tool.
That's what it's being built towards, and that's what the financial incentives drive the people making it towards doing, right? Like, I think I wish that we were in the alternate universe where this shit wasn't very popular with investors and someone was doing tools to make your job of doing EQ easier. Like, those tools, I mean, weirdly, some of the stuff that Photoshop have done with like generative fills and stuff, I can genuinely see how that would speed up a pipeline. It's not how I want to speed up my pipeline, but I can see how it would. Those things as tools, I'm totally into. Like, I think that theoretically, if it can again be done ethically, blah, 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 I think those things have value. But yes, it's like you say, they're not tools. They are showcases.
They're like toys. Yeah, right.
They're toys. They're toys for people who can't make stuff. What they should be making is tools for people who can make stuff, so those people can make better stuff. And there'll be people in the comments going, "Well, it's just around the corner, and sooner or later." But
I mean, in fairness, I have a software engineer friend who I remember asking about this a while ago in a similar question, where I said, are there versions of this that would be useful to someone like you? And he said, I've used, I can't remember which specific one. It wasn't one I had heard of. I think it was a little more esoterically designed. Like, it was a more fringy one. I can't remember. It wasn't like a famous like ChatGPT or something, but
sure.
It basically, he said, I feel like I have a really, a slightly less fallible assistant, because he goes, it lets me get stuff done. I get more than my normal day's work done in a day using this tool. But he goes, the thing is, if I didn't know as much as I know about engineering, I wouldn't even know how to use it. So he goes, it's not a replacement so much as a force multiplier. And I remember thinking that, like, it's, in other words, he just would not have had an assistant. So it didn't cost anyone a job in his particular case, at least. But it was an interesting way of going, I can get 16 hours of work done in 8 hours or in 10 hours or whatever. And I remember thinking that sounds awesome. Like that
Yeah.
sounds like a really cool use of the technology. And to the extent that that becomes the norm, and when we like lose
that
our
would-
excitement for all the
yeah.
silly, just like make me an image of a dog
And
on
that's
a bike.
probably that's the most optimistic read I've heard that I believe on this situation, which is it is a bubble. Obviously, it's about like financially. I think we're past.
Boy,
the
it
point
sure
where anyone
seems
can
like
argue
it.
otherwise. But if you look at the history of lots of things, they have had bubbles and then have eventually useful versions have come up. So the obvious example is the internet bubble, right? There was that and it blew up and it was terrible financially, but eventually the internet's been pretty fucking useful, right? So there's like
Right. Yeah.
there is this argument that like maybe this is just a bunch of greedy people making stupid choices, and once those people have lost all their money, or more likely lost other people all their money and moved on to some whatever the next boondoggle is, then the researchers and nerds will find cool uses for this stuff. I think that's very likely. I had the same feeling about NFTs. I don't know if anyone has found an interesting use for NFTs yet, but like someone might at some point, So I'm open to it on that level. I need it to be ethical, and that's the biggest concern I have is especially with the generative models that are very popular at the moment. The CEOs of those companies themselves have said that the companies couldn't exist without stealing content. So to me, that at that point, that's an unviable product. Piracy is a crime unless you're a mega corporation. So yeah, I don't know. I share your optimism that something useful might come out of this down the road. I do think that. I'm not
God
seeing
knows
it
there's
right
a few use cases that I could imagine within my work where if I had the ability to real time generate based on a pool that I'm providing, like if I go and write 3 hours of music and I need it to be able to extrapolate that into to kind of flexibly turn to more liquid in real time, boy, could I do some crazy shit with interactive music that would excite me. But I don't even know, again, now you're talking about something that's operating in real time at runtime, and that's like a whole other level of tech challenge,
which theoretically could be possible, and
at some point, yeah, but
the hurdles are interesting to that. I had it with the thing I'm prototyping at the moment. I had a moment where I was like, man, an LLM that could run live could do something really interesting in this moment. If I could use an LLM without knowing it was stealing hundreds of millions of other people's work over here.
right.
That's what's frustrating to me, is that these tools are interesting and could be put to interesting uses and experimented with and make cool stuff. It sucks that we're in this world where to do so is, I think unavoidably and inexcusably a bad thing, and that sucks. I'm annoyed by that because I'd like to play with these toys if they were ethical, for sure.
Yeah,
But there's lots of things I'd like to do if it was ethical and legal. So
have you been jonesing for murder? Is that
That's right.
your bucket list?
There's a couple of people, Austin. There's a couple of fucking people.
You're just like American Psycho. You just kind of like always.
We should have an AI purge day. We should have one day a year you could use AI to do anything unethical.
Oh boy.
Good.
Well, perfect. Well, I'm going to leave it on that note. I just realized the time. I'm actually 9 minutes late for a meeting, so I got to run. But hopefully this saves. I guess Alana is not alive and was your first victim. So that's our breaking
Yeah, I
news
did
here.
kill Alana moments before the call started.
Yes,
I actually
impressive.
need to go and do a Breaking Bad now and dispose of the evidence.
Dissolve the body. Yes. Well,
Yeah.
just remember the material of your container is very important.
I do. Yes, I do remember that. All right.
All right. Catch you later. Thank you, sir. Good times.
Bye bye.
See ya.